Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Respect podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
And I'm Wesley Faulkner. I'm super happy about this topic and this guest. And so I really want to make sure that we have enough time for everything. So I will try to not fanboy out during this recording and like to introduce us to our guest, Kim.
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to hand it off to you, Maureen, to introduce yourself. But both Wesley and I read and love your book and are excited to talk about it. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm very excited to be here too. Thank you for the invitation. So I have been working in the neurodiversity space for over 2 decades, and it's just been my passion, my life's work. I've not only have lived experience, but this has been the focus of my professional career and expertise. And I studied even for my PhD, focused on this topic at Oxford when I was on a Rhodes Scholarship, and also have, very much I'm part of the community and very active in advocacy as well.
Well, that's awesome. If you wouldn't mind, could you maybe talk a little bit about how your relationship to the neurodivergent community? Like, do you identify as neurodivergent, and how so?
Yes. And so I fit a couple different boxes. So I've always, it's always been, I always have known I was neurodivergent. But I fit into what we'd call ADHD. So that's both autistic and ADHD. And then I also, as a child, I knew I was hyperlexia. So hyperlexic, I was reading fluently before I turned 3. And then I also have something called conceptual synesthesia.
And I would love to hear more about. These are all advantages, I think, but I think also many advantages can be hard. And so I would the title of your book is the Neurodiversity Edge, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about how how this has given you an edge, and also how maybe people haven't respected the differences in your life.
Yeah, so in a couple of things. I mean, first, I would say I started out the book on introducing Flatland. I probably remember, because I do think that there are, I mean, a lot of neurodivergent people, their strengths and their challenges are both invisible in a lot of ways, right? So it's you can't tell who's neurodivergent, right? By looking by, there's not a neurodivergent look, although there are traits, I think, that at least other neurodivergent people would spot more easily maybe than neurotypical people. But I think the idea is that what I was really trying to show my book, not just that there's a lot of strengths that neurodivergent people bring to the table, which there are, and that often are missed, especially in traditional interview processes. There's a lot of autistic people that have strengths in sort of pattern detection, 3-dimensional visualization skills. There's all sorts of skills that aren't going to necessarily translate well into a verbal social process in the interview. But moreover, I think one of the arguments I really wanted, especially leaders, to understand is that if their organizational culture is welcoming to people that are different, that's going to translate into a competitive edge, that's going to translate into a healthier organizational culture that's ultimately going to help everyone, not even just neurodivergent people. And the edge is in that experiential and cognitive diversity, because In my opinion, if you're, and I've seen this a lot in just the work I do with corporations and organizations as well, is if your team is completely cognitively and experientially correlated, and you have even if you're hiring really top talent, if everybody's pretty similar in terms of background and experiential, cognitive, and perceptual tendencies, there's ultimately going to be blind spots. There's the groupthink risk. There's missed innovation. There's a lot of blind spots that ultimately will, I think, be a huge disadvantage as well to corporations. So I'm thinking about the edge as it's a systems. It's thinking about neurodiversity and belonging from a systems perspective. And if we just start comparing individuals to individuals all the time, we miss the incredible contributions that all kinds of minds bring collectively. Like we shouldn't all have to be the same.
Yeah.
There's a lot of advantages to having people who think differently, working collaboratively with neurotypical people.
I
Oh,
love
that's
that.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so important to think about it from a systems point of view as well as and I appreciate that you're being humble here, in that you're saying it's not that it gave me an edge, it gives a whole organization an edge when when everybody doesn't think about things in exactly the same way. Although I imagine it also gave you as an individual some some advantages. Wesley, I think I interrupted you. You were going to
Oh
say
no,
something.
I was just really like deep into it, and wanted to talk about a little bit more about the concepts in the book. You mentioned the three C's. I was hoping you could explain those and what that actually means.
Yeah, sure. So the three C's is codification and conduct drives culture. And so, um, on the one hand, I've worked with a lot of organizations that have wanted me to help codify their policies. Let's look at our, HR handbooks. Let's look at are we doing enough for neurodiversity? Um, how do we help with supporting our employees? We already know every organization, whether they realize it or not, has neurodivergent employees. I mean,
Yeah,
it's 20% or more of the global population, and I think companies are more and more realizing that whether it's through the employee resource groups, like we need to be doing more to supporting the employees we have, and ultimately establishing opportunity pathways to recruit more. But if all the companies and organizations are doing are value statements and putting together policy frameworks, that's it, and they're not thinking about what's happening, in actual day-to-day conduct with peers. If there's not alignment with what an organization says they value and how people actually behave right on the day-to-day, that's ultimately going to be a toxic culture,
yeah,
particularly for neurodivergent people. And it's been interesting the work I've done, because and I've had some personal lived experience with this as well. But there's sometimes been I've seen it from both sides, where there's sometimes been organizations or companies that seem incredibly open-minded and supportive in terms of valuing differences, in terms of their outward-facing messages. And then the deeper you start to interact with leadership and what just is allowed to happen on a day-to-day basis, right? Even what upward bullying, right? Even like it's people that make it into management and leadership, once that person discloses, I've seen some things that have been kind of shocking, frankly. But if that's sort of if leaders and if peers even turn a blind eye to bullying, to discrimination, to and a lot of times it's covert too, like where there's just someone's credibility gets undermined behind the scenes, because there's jealousy, or because there's it's just really about power and control, even though the neurodivergent person just really cares about the company and says, hey, I think we could do this a different way. And that's so it's just, so to me, if the focus is on Let's we're all on the same team. We need to build the kind of culture that's really going to take this organization forward. And it's not about just protecting particular individuals or power structures. Then everybody should at least, you'd think, be proactively, in good faith, trying to take responsibility for building these communication and empathy bridges. And that makes such a huge difference in my experience for neurodivergent people. It's okay to make mistakes. Like, we all make mistakes. And, it's more just feeling like we're working with leaders and peers who are operating in good faith, that there's a trust that if we disclose, it's not going to be used against us. And so I kind of caution leaders of, in the one hand, it's really important for all sorts of reasons to update your policies, make sure there's an anti-harassment, anti-bullying. Neurodivergence is specifically mentioned. But if that's all you're doing and there's not leadership in terms of what kind of taking responsibility for what's actually happening in your company on a day to day and what's acceptable or not rewarding people, say, that will make fun of neurodivergent people or someone who's displaying neurodivergent traits, whether that's pacing around the room or using a fidget toy. It's important to just be normalizing these conversations if we're going to actually reach what I would call authentic neuroinclusion and belonging, which is where I think the true value of all employees start to manifest, because there is that level of trust and safety.
Yeah, I think that's so important. If we don't create consequences for people who make it difficult to be in the workplace, then there's no point in recruiting people who you then treat badly. You know,
Right.
uh,
Or at
and,
least don't be rewarding, right? People that
yeah,
create environments that aren't safe for others to disclose and be who they are.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned in the book is not just about it being important for people who are neurodivergent, but you talk about Google Project Aristotle, where they actually looked at teams and how they're structured and which ones are higher performing ones. Um, why do you think, if a company like Google, who has done their own first party research, has come to their own conclusions about what they need, why do you think it's hard for companies to actually put the mechanisms in place to make sure that they follow through?
Yeah, I mean, so and I do think it takes some teasing a part of things, because there's different ways people have also defined psychological safety, right? But I think at the core, what was fascinating, I think, about Project Aristotle is that it you a lot you some may assume that it'd be the most the teams that had the most resources, right? That would have be the most innovative, and but then it makes sense that it's those that would have that high level of trust and psychological safety, so there could be um, a culture where it's not costly, right, to take intellectual risks, and to push boundaries. And even if someone in that group, if there is it has a wild idea that ultimately the team does not use, just obviously, there's going to be huge advantages to innovation if there's that those there it's encouraged, right, to be going against the status quo. And I think there's so then now when you extend that to neurodiversity as well, I mean, that kind of environment will naturally, I think, be a culture that a lot of neurodivergent people would feel like they could fit in, because a lot of neurodivergent people aren't very correlated, cognitively or perceptually or experientially on a team, and need to feel like they could be themselves and challenge how things are being done and not be penalized for doing so. So there's alignment there, but then it's also this other layer of, if someone is talking about the, normalizing the conversations of just identity, right, and being neurodivergent, or being allowed to display neurodivergent traits and not having to put a lot of energy into masking, and that's embraced, and then that will allow neurodivergent people to spend more of their time on the innovation of thinking. So the innovation, the likelihood for innovation would go even up. Now, your question of why that's not being put into, I mean, I've worked with a lot of different companies that, where there's different priorities, right, in terms of how leaders want to, uh, what kind of culture that leaders want to embrace. And I've seen some short-sighted CEOs, in my opinion, where, I don't know, just as a quick example, there's, I'm not going to mention any names or which organization, but, I've seen it more than once, where there's organizations where CEOs just get very concerned about their own status, and, to the point of trying to control who's on their boards, being, much more concerned about their own power and their own position at the detriment to the company, to the shareholders, to the products, to the customers, to all the other employees. And somehow it's like, it becomes a very insular, in and out group culture, where, there's the people who are on the inside, and then and then there's everyone else. And I've seen that. And, and so I think that there's, unfortunately, there are some cultures that I would say are bad cultures, that ultimately are harmful to everyone else in that organization. But there's these small power groups that are incentivized to keep things that way. And so I think it's a threat then to change it, even though in the long, it's very short-sighted. In the long run, that's going to be a much, much more successful organization and company if, if there was openness to, creating the kind of culture where everyone felt excited to go to work. There wasn't this culture of fear. There wasn't this, oh, I've got to, I'm going to really upset the CEO if I, do things this way. Or so I've seen that, even on boards, being a challenge for, neurodivergent people being what I would call authentically included, because I've seen some short-sighted leaders that almost see it as a threat to their position, because they could, if they want the groupthink.
Yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, they don't want someone to stand up and say, wait a minute, why are you making, 10 times more than the budget of this organization? So, I mean, so I've just seen some interesting things where there are crazy situations where there's a small minority of people that are incentivized to try to reinforce the status quo.
To sort of
But
demand conformity, demand that everybody
yeah, and
show
try to,
up in a
and then they
particular
usually,
way.
and this doesn't usually work very well when you get into, much larger organizations where there's a lot more independent directors and things like that. But it's been interesting to see where, when you ask, like, why isn't it happening everywhere? Because it should be right across the board. Because to me, at least, it's obvious that, of course, especially the economic and technological context we have in front of us. Of course, at least I think it's this huge asset. The main edge is going to be having the people that can work alongside technology and be able to bring different perspectives, right? But I do think that there's there are some challenges there, and it all, I guess the other thing is just even people that are well intentioned, it just, it gets into like inertia, right? Just a lot of people that get used to things being a certain way. The idea of things changing just can get uncomfortable.
Yeah. We say in tech we want to think different, and yet we don't always welcome it.
Yeah, one of the examples in the book is I think a CEO whose son was diagnosed with autism, or who is autistic. Sorry about that. And he tries to build an organization that kind of supports this. Um, because of this tendency, I'm going to call it gravity towards groupthink, even though there might be good like pull to implement something that you know is right, even though there's stats to show that this is actually a higher performing team and more innovation comes out of places that have more welcoming cultures. What kind of mechanisms do you see companies like that put in place to make sure that they actually follow through?
Yeah, and so I think you're talking about the story of Mark in my book, and yeah, that was I was really excited to work with him because it means a lot. First of all, when the CEOs are all in my experience, like because it changes the dynamics in the whole team and in the whole organization if people see. And so for him, he was very much he was very supportive of being the one as CEO going around the office and telling positive stories about neurodivergent people in the company, just really working hard to show that kind of leadership that it's something that he personally valued. And then it was really interesting to see because then over time there were a lot of neurodivergent employees he had that he didn't know were neurodivergent, that it became it became a comfortable conversation, and where then suddenly there were several employees that just felt like, I was never going to talk about this, but now I feel like I can without risking my job. And so I know there was one of his engineers who was ADHD, then just we started talking about that, and then other peers started to realize that some of the strengths that he had in terms of his creativity and some of the products that he developed actually weren't, despite having ADHD, but because that's
Yes.
part of him, and because of how he thinks, and then it just kind of snowballed. Where then instead of seeing this as a stigma, right? People were genuinely um, talking about it more openly and their struggles too. And then there was just so much more excitement, to especially for the neurodivergent employees to go to work. And there was that just a different level of commitment. And then the CEO, I kept in touch with him. And so over the years, he said that just really being all in that direction really changed his culture for the better, in way beyond even just being able to promote neurodivergent employees that made it to managers or director levels or above, but also just that there was just a more openness, and communication was more transparent. People trusted each other in a different way, and so that was, I think, I was really happy to work with that company because especially because the CEO was so enthusiastic from the beginning, and I do think that made a difference.
Yeah, it's great to turn thinking differently should be an asset. It is, and should be considered an asset, not a liability, and that's good for everyone. Not 100%. It's a great story.
And you said it's easier to have people on board when they're already convinced, because then they'll look for the evidence that supports their view. And the book does a really good job of giving a lot of examples of why it's a good thing to kind of invest in making sure that it's an inclusive environment. A lot of the examples, or the way that you try to do it, is usually from a business standpoint. This is good for business. You're going to run out of people, and so on and so forth. And you also, like you mentioned, you have 20 years of experience, like talking about this, advocating for this. In the book, it really kind of leans into the business argument, which makes sense because of the target audience who would be reading it. In your travels and your conversations, personally though, have you ever seen a moral argument win out about like it's just the right thing to do as opposed to it's the thing that helps business?
Well, and I think in my book, I'm trying to argue it's both. That there's this there's this huge disproportionality in economic opportunity between um, millions of people that have so much to offer the world and are being excluded. Not just from meaningful paid work, right? Which the numbers are quite depressing. I mean, across all the typologies, is 30 to 40% of neurodivergent that are unemployed, right? Where the national average is well under 4%. And for autistic people in particular, there's some stats out there. There's different stats, but some could be as high as 85%, and that's including people with college degrees. So there's definitely a moral argument. I mean, there's so many skilled people out there that are being disproportionately, or maybe if you look out throughout history, a lot of neurodivergent people have disproportionately accounted for a lot of our innovations, but at the same time, the same community um, is most neurodivergent people really struggle with unemployment or underemployment or accepting jobs well below their skill level. And at the same time, I think it's important for employers to realize that it's the value that neurodivergent people bring to them. That it's not about charity. It's about just understanding how to assess talent in a way that is not how we've traditionally been assessing talent or thinking about talent from a human resources perspective, or how we do our standardized interview process. So I think it's both, and it's any CEO operating a business um, is obviously going to be thinking about this differently. Will always is going to be thinking about they need to be thinking about their business and their shareholders. But the idea is that making the changes to allow for all kinds of minds to thrive will the moral argument is there too, but it also it helps the individual find a place to belong, finally find a community where they're accepted, find meaningful paid work, and it also helps it's also a huge win for the employer.
Yeah, so important. I want to go back to what you were saying before about bullying and people getting bullied. Somebody asked me this question, and I'm not sure if I answered it right. So I'd love to get your thoughts. So there was a person, I was giving a talk recently, and there was a person who said that they were neurodivergent, and that other people experienced them as a bully, but that was not their intention. And so they felt that they were being unjustly accused of bully. They were being bullied for being considered a bull. You know what I mean? It was like
Right, right, right.
so how can we help people get through, like, this person was very blunt in the way they spoke, and other people had their feelings hurt by that. But so how do we help teams where that sort of thing is happening?
Yeah,
uh
and
uh
so you may remember in my book I had this framework, this pyramid
mhm,
of neuroinclusion, and one of the layers that I think is incredibly important is really about bridging empathy. I called it the Universal Empathy Network, and
mhm,
bridging empathy and communication gaps. And I think, and I've seen situations like what you're describing, and sometimes everyone is really well intentioned, and there's just such a gap in in shared experiences,
Yeah.
we're sort of missing each other, right? And
Yeah.
just one or two pieces of information is all that's needed, and
Yeah.
then there's
We
like
can
this
come
aha
together.
moment of,
Yeah.
oh wait, and I bring up a case study in the context of showcasing the double empathy problem, which we could get into if we have time here as well. But I think but then I've also seen some cases where, I think, so I think you've maybe at first, if someone says that, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt and kind of see, well, can we come, in a respectful way, can we try to listen to each other and find some common ground where we can see different perspectives. And I think that's when you start to see if someone really is well intentioned or not. Because then if the bullying that's someone doesn't see as bullying still continues, or it escalates but in a different way, or if, and I've seen this too, where if I say, hey, I have some auditory sensitivities, and someone's there in the meeting or at a board, screaming in my ear,
Yeah.
trying to, and you say something, and someone still does it. So
Yeah.
I think that's where the
Yeah.
real test is if
Yes.
you try, right? You try in good faith to say, here's how I experience things in the world. Let me hear your perspective. And sometimes there needs to be someone sort of facilitating that kind of those conversations, and trying to bridge these empathy and communication gaps, which is something I've really enjoyed doing too with companies. But if it still continues, or someone finds different ways to uh, you know really harass or throw someone off their game,
Yeah.
then I think, it's like, well, I don't know.
Yeah. Now that is the definition of bullying,
Yeah.
right? Is if I tell you that I'm experiencing something a particular way, and then if you explain to me why it's happening, then it's up to me to interpret correctly, to give you the benefit of the doubt. Is that what you mean by double empathy? I'd love to hear more about
Well,
that.
the double empathy promise, it's really a fascinating um, theory in neurodiversity. That's, where there's research that looks at how autistic people in particular, and neurotypical people, can sometimes both fail to understand the other. And it's not, and the idea is that it's not just a problem or a deficit in autistic cognition alone. It's that there's the lack of shared experiences. And so one example might be where autistic people interacting with other autistic people don't really struggle as much. Not that all autistic people agree with each other, um, but that, they might not struggle to understand each other as much, because they're drawing upon, like, similar understanding about, okay, challenges in getting work, or sensory challenges, a dislike for sort of superficial small talk. And the neurotypical people, but have just as difficult of a time of a time understanding autistic intentions and ways of thinking, because they'll see, what might appear to be, lack of interest in small talk as rudeness, right? Because they don't have that experience with other neurotypical people. So the idea is, it's like, it's really about everybody struggles to understand other people that have, different life experiences. But then the great thing there is that there's so much we can do to proactively uh, build those bridges and understand different perspectives. But the effort can't come from one side alone. It can't be just the autistic people trying to conform to neurotypical standards of doing things or communication. But if we're all putting in effort, kind of like how we do, if we go to a foreign country, right? It's expected, like, there might be some mishaps, some communication gaps, and everybody kind of usually works to close those gaps and not judge. And yet we haven't learned to do that really well across neurotypes.
Yeah. So important.
Yeah, like eye contact and networking, or when you're meeting someone, or physical touch, like shaking hands and such. There's, I remember seeing the stories about people who were masking during the pandemic and how more comfortable they felt because of being able to assuage some of the usual networking and connection when you meet someone new, and also working remotely also gives you that advantages in some ways that you can control your environment. And so it's amazing how when there's the ability to have flexibility on how people interact, how they get work done, or how they choose to participate or not, how that could actually make people feel more comfortable to be in a good place to do their best work.
For sure. And then, the other thing I think is just super important is when there are these cultures, these organizational cultures that are, where it feels safe to disclose, and we're normalizing the conversations like the one we're having now, then more people feel like they can talk about this, and ultimately that benefits. It's a personal decision whether to disclose or not, but I think it benefits the younger generations and society as a whole, because otherwise, one of the problems I see is that especially something like autism and ADHD too, and some other neurodivergencies, is that there's a lot of stereotyping. It's not intentional most of the time, but it's just the examples that immediately come to mind, which is largely unconscious and just the way our brains work, tend to be what people have been exposed to. And there's just been such limited examples of people who have disclosed in leadership, or examples in the movies which aren't very representative. And then I think there's always this danger then that assumptions get made, right, about what an ADHD can or can't do, what an autistic person looks like, what is dyslexia, because we haven't as a society been exposed to the rich diversity and range in which neurodivergence manifests itself.
Right. And they could be working next to a neurodivergent coworker, but they haven't been comfortable sharing their experience. And so when they're asked, like, do you know anyone who's neurodivergent? They're like, no, I have no one.
For sure. And what's been fascinating for me and so rewarding with the book is after the book came out, and I've been doing a lot of talks and workshops and public speaking, like just it's been so interesting that in these spaces where then people start to feel very comfortable, where there has been some pretty prominent people in those environments then that have sort of come out and started disclosing, and then everyone around's like, oh, really? I didn't know you were, you were neurodivergent. And then other people start talking about it too. And so it's been really interesting. And then I've had other people write to me saying that they always knew they were different. People that have worked at Google, or other prominent technology companies, but hadn't had had only recently been diagnosed, and then didn't have the vocabulary for what they were experiencing until they read the book. And so, but I think the more, again, it's just sort of like the more these conversations are normalized, the better I think organizations are going to be at not only having these conversations, but learning how to truly embrace differences.
Yeah, I think it's such a waste of energy to have to try to fit into some mold that doesn't quite fit you. Like, it's exhausting. And I think everybody in some way, shape, or form at some point in their life has experienced that. And I think the more we can come together and like ask people to stand out, not fit in, the happier we will all be.
Right.
And you wrote the book, but you also have a practice. If people were interested in using your services and to engage with you, what's the name of the book? Where can they find it? And how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, the name of the book's The Neurodiversity Edge. People can find me. I mean, I have a website for the book, which is just www.theneurodiversityedge.org. I also have a consultancy called Autism Community Ventures as well.
So great. Maureen Dunne is the author. The book is The Neurodiversity Edge. Please buy this book and help roll out Maureen's ideas in your organization. Thank you so much, Maureen, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed being here and appreciated the invitation.
Real pleasure. Thank you for having us and showing up on our show, because I know it was a treat for me. So thank you.
No, I was really excited to be here and just talk to both of you.
And Wesley is telling the truth. He really has been looking forward to this for a long time. That smile is genuine.
Mine too. No, I've been at first. When I was.
I'm sorry. I'm going to just say, take care, everybody. Wesley, you want to take us home?
Yes, thank you for joining us on the show. And if you would like to email us, you can reach us at hello@radicalrespectbook.com. You can rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, and we would like to hear your feedback. And if you have any guests or if you'd like to be on the show, so share your stories, or if you think that there's something that we can do better. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.